This wasn't a market surprise. This was a controlled redefinition of exposure. In the next few minutes, I'll show you three things: what changed inside the silver plumbing, why the largest desks accepted it without a public fight, and what it forces next for anyone still pricing silver off the screen instead of the settlement terms. The title says Quiet Rule Shift, and that's the correct framing, because the story the public receives is always about price. Up days, down days, volatility, inflation, a headline about demand. The private move is never about price. It's about enforceability. In public, the narrative sounds like silver finally broke out or finally rolled over. Behind closed doors, the conversation is about whether the paper promise remains equivalent to metal and whether a dealer can stay short without being forced to perform in a tighter window than their funding model can tolerate. The reason the number matters, $25 billion, is not because it's theatrical. It's because once exposure is that large, the system stops treating silver like a commodity and starts treating it like a balance sheet hazard that must be managed with procedure, not opinion. When the rulebook shifts quietly, exposure doesn't evaporate. It changes shape. It migrates from price risk to settlement risk, from mark-to-market to mark-to-terms, and that's where institutions either lock in the trade or get locked in by it. Here's the public story versus the private move. Publicly, you're told banks are just market makers, that they hedge everything, and that silver is liquid enough to absorb any demand. Privately, desks know silver liquidity is conditional, and the condition is that most participants never ask for the thing the contract implies. The system is engineered around roll behavior. Positions cycle forward, cash differences settle, and physical delivery remains the exception that provides credibility. That model breaks the moment too many participants decide the only hedge that matters is actual allocation: bars, serials, warrants, and title that survives a stress event. The quiet rule shift in this context is never announced as a rewrite. It arrives as an enforcement change. A clause that was available becomes preferred. A window that was flexible becomes strict. An alternative settlement pathway that used to be optional becomes the default option under stress. That sounds subtle until you understand what it does to a large short book. A big short position can be economically hedged and still be operationally trapped if the path to performance narrows. If you shorten the timeline, tighten eligible forms, or broaden what counts as equivalent settlement, you alter who carries the scramble cost when physical is scarce. The market still prints a price, but the real pricing shifts into the spread between what paper says and what physical demands, and that detail changes the interpretation. The mechanism is a lever buried in settlement architecture, the conversion channel between paper exposure and deliverable metal, and the discretion that sits above it. You don't need metaphors here, you need clean mechanics. A bank desk can write enormous paper exposure, futures, swaps, forwards, unallocated liabilities, because those instruments net efficiently and clear through institutional plumbing designed for speed. But physical performance cannot be netted into existence. It must be sourced, transported, assayed, warranted, and delivered through a schedule that does not care about balance sheet elegance. A quiet rule shift works like this. It modifies the penalty structure and the timing structure so that, under stress, the cheapest outcome for the system is not deliver metal, but reroute settlement into a cash-like or deferred channel, while still preserving the appearance of contract integrity. The bank accepts it because it prevents a disorderly squeeze today, even if it locks them into a longer exposure tomorrow. The long accepts it because they receive a premium to defer. The exchange accepts it because it protects the clearing function. And the public never sees the negotiation because the negotiation is framed as normal settlement operations. The result is forced participation without the word forced ever being used. Desks that plan to roll are compelled to address delivery risk. Holders that plan to be passive are incentivized to choose between immediacy and payout, and the system funnels behavior into the outcome it can survive. Now the timeline ladder, because this is where the retention hinge sits: 6 beats, no fluff. First, an imbalance appears that doesn't show up in headlines. The physical pipeline tightens, not globally, but in the specific channels that satisfy institutional delivery. Then, spreads start behaving like warnings. Front month stays stubborn. Lease rates harden, and the easy liquidity is suddenly conditional on accepting different terms. Third, the desks with the largest short exposure stop competing on price and start competing on time. They pay to roll risk forward, they pay to obtain optionality, and they pay to keep metal requests from clustering. But that's not the real pressure point. Fourth, the quiet rule shift arrives in practice. Settlement discretion widens, exceptions become precedent, and the market learns which outcomes are protected. Fifth, behavior flips. Holders demand allocation, dealers ration size, and banks treat silver not as a trade but as a liability they must warehouse. Here's where the incentives show up. Sixth, the hinge point locks. Once the market prices terms above spot, The paper price becomes a reference, not a clearing level, and exposure becomes sticky because every attempt to unwind pushes on the same thin physical layer. And that's the hinge point. Incentives, directly. Who benefits? The institutions closest to the rulebook and the settlement channels benefit because they can convert chaos into procedure and procedure into predictable outcomes. They also benefit because they can keep price discovery from reflecting scarcity immediately, buying time to reposition without paying full public premiums. Who gets boxed in? Anyone short who relies on rolling liquidity to remain cheap gets boxed in because the cost of time rises and the cost of immediacy rises faster. Also boxed in are industrial users who cannot wait because they're forced to pay possession premiums while the screen price pretends everything is fine. What gets hidden? The true clearing price of urgency. It gets hidden in side payments, in off-screen settlement, in deferred obligations that look like normal operations, and in the widening gap between what an ounce is worth on a chart and what it costs to secure in a deliverable form. What this breaks next, system level, with crisp triggers. If physical requests cluster into the same window, then discretionary settlement becomes unavoidable because the system protects clearing first. If margin requirements rise into a move while liquidity thins, then forced covering becomes unavoidable because funding breaks before conviction does. If spreads detach and remain detached through a full settlement cycle, then the paper benchmark loses authority because price discovery relocates to the only venue still delivering. Those are not hypotheticals, those are mechanical outcomes once the lever is pulled and the market learns it has been pulled. Viewer translation in 3 buckets. If you hold cash, you watch purchasing power through the lens of what becomes rationed first. Availability, not headlines. Because rationing is the earliest proof of regime shift. If you hold risk assets, you watch correlation behavior during stress windows, because funding events pull everything into the same trade at the same time. If you rely on a paycheck, you watch industrial input pressures, because when silver becomes allocation-driven, downstream costs rise quietly before they show up in official inflation narratives. The 5-rule playbook, phrased as behavior, not advice. Don't chase the screen price after the move. Chase clarity on settlement terms. Track physical availability weekly, not sentiment daily. Assume the headline lags the plumbing, because public stories arrive after private repricing. Treat spreads and delivery conditions as the signal, not the spot print. Keep optionality, time, liquidity, and flexibility, because those are what the system charges for when rule shifts begin. Close the unanswered file. The open question isn't whether banks are exposed, it's whether the 25B is being neutralized or merely being rolled forward under friendlier settlement language until the next window. The moment you can't see is the moment the market stops negotiating deferral and starts demanding performance. That file isn't closed, it's being moved. The quiet rule shift is not a memo that hits the newswire. It's the moment the market's enforceable rules stop matching the market's assumed rules and the gap gets priced into behavior. Inside these systems, the most dangerous exposures are the ones that are hedged on a spreadsheet, but unhedged in the only place that counts, the settlement path. A 25 Bale silver book is not a directional bet in the way retail imagines it. It's an ecosystem of offsets, maturities, collateral agreements, and delivery contingencies that stay stable only if the clearing and settlement definitions remain fixed. When those definitions move, even slightly, the exposure doesn't disappear. It becomes sticky, and the desk becomes locked in, because exiting requires using the same pipes that are now constrained. The rule shift typically takes one of 3 forms. It narrows the acceptable delivery pathway, it widens what counts as equivalent performance, or it changes the enforcement timing so that the cheapest response is to defer or reroute rather than to deliver. In plain terms, the system learns to protect continuity first and price truth second. That is why the number is so large. Once you're at that scale, you can't just close the book without revealing stress. And you can't reveal stress without triggering the next round of tightening. The pressure point is not whether banks can pay, it's whether they can perform without breaking the illusion of abundance. So Act 2 here is a controlled squeeze that looks like normal operations. The public expects squeezes to be loud. Candles, headlines, a rush. This one is quiet because it happens in the margin between instruments. The spread between paper claims and deliverable units, the cost of borrowing metal, the premium for immediacy, the haircuts on collateral, the language and confirmations. When a desk is short optionality, it relies on the ability to roll cheaply and source metal opportunistically. A quiet rule shift flips that. Rolling becomes a toll road, sourcing becomes conditional, and optionality becomes something you must buy back at the worst moment. That's when a bank gets boxed in. They can keep their book open and accept the new terms, or try to reduce exposure and discover that the act of reducing exposure is what forces prices and spreads against them. And because this is a closed room environment, the first response is always coordination through incentives. Pay longs to defer, pay counterparties to accept alternative settlement forms, reroute obligations into bilateral channels, and keep the visible benchmark calm. That's not conspiracy, it's clearinghouse logic. A system designed to net obligations will always choose the path that nets the most with the least public disruption, especially when the alternative is an overt settlement failure. Now run the timeline ladder again, but at the operational level, because that's where retention stays high. First, inventories that matter, deliverable, not theoretical, tighten, and the physical side starts pricing urgency. Then, the paper market keeps trading smoothly, which convinces most observers nothing has changed, but desks begin paying up in private to avoid clustering delivery demand. Third, the exchange or clearing rules are interpreted with more discretion so that timing and equivalence become flexible under stress. But that's not the real pressure point. Fourth, the discretionary behavior becomes precedent. Counterparties start expecting deferral premiums, longs learn they can extract terms, and shorts learn they must budget for it. Fifth, funding conditions react. Haircuts rise, margin models tighten, and the cost of holding a short book increases even if spot is flat. Here's where the incentives show up. Sixth, the book becomes self-reinforcing. Every attempt to reduce it forces the desk to pay the same scarcity premium that the rule shift was designed to postpone, so the exposure becomes a semi-permanent position, managed, rolled, and warehoused until a catalyst forces performance. This is the part sophisticated viewers miss. The real game is not, can the bank buy silver? The real game is, can the bank buy time? Time is the scarce commodity in a settlement event because time determines whether you can source metal without bidding against yourself, whether you can meet collateral calls without selling other assets, and whether you can keep counterparties from coordinating against your weakness. A quiet rule shift is, effectively, a time engineering device. It converts an immediate performance obligation into a managed process where the system can distribute pain gradually. But distributing pain gradually does not eliminate it. It changes who holds it and when. If you're a bank short, you hold it as a rolling liability. If you're a long with leverage, you're pressured to take cash or defer. If you're an industrial buyer, you're pushed into direct sourcing outside the exchange. If you're the exchange, you protect the clearing function by keeping failure off the screen. And that is exactly how a 25B exposure becomes locked. Not because there is no way out, but because every way out has become a cost-revealing event the system refuses to allow all at once. Now bring it back to the title's phrase, behind closed doors, because that's not rhetorical, it's structural. The most consequential parts of modern commodity markets are bilateral and procedural. Credit agreements, collateral schedules, settlement confirmations, warehouse rules, delivery notices, and the discretion clauses that govern disruption. Those are negotiated quietly because the moment they're negotiated loudly, you've already lost control of expectations. The public sees a chart, the institutions see a queue. The chart can stay calm while the queue becomes expensive. And when the queue becomes expensive, the difference between a solvent book and an insolvent book is not price direction, it's funding continuity. That's why the rule shift matters more than the spot print. It changes the funding path. It turns what used to be a low-cost rolling exposure into a high-carry exposure with periodic stress windows. Over time, that changes behavior across the entire market because participants learn that physical is not merely preferred, it's senior. The final consequence is not a headline spike in silver, it's a slow change in what institutions treat as real. Once a 25B book is locked behind new settlement interpretations, the market stops being a price arena and becomes a terms arena because the cheapest path is no longer to clear exposure, it's to warehouse it, roll it, and negotiate around it. The immediate sign you watch is not spot. It's whether the cost of time keeps rising, roll incentives widen, borrow rates stay firm, and counterparties demand better collateral language for the same notional. That's the second order effect that matters. When a desk can't reduce exposure without paying an immediacy premium, the exposure becomes a permanent resident on balance sheets, and the broader system absorbs the risk by changing what it calls normal. Now, the forward consequences. In the exact trigger format, if the physical pipeline tightens into a single settlement window, then discretionary settlement becomes unavoidable because the clearing system protects continuity before performance. If collateral haircuts rise while price remains calm, then forced de-risking becomes unavoidable because funding breaks before narratives do. If spreads stay detached through a full roll cycle, then the benchmark loses authority because serious buyers will price off deliverability and bypass the paper lane entirely. Each of those triggers produces the same behavioral outcome. Capital stops asking, what is silver worth, and starts asking, what is silver deliverable? Translation for viewers is simple and unsentimental. If you hold cash, you treat rationing signals as the real inflation indicator. Availability tells the truth before CPI does. If you hold risk assets, you track funding stress because it drags correlations toward one at the worst time. If you rely on a paycheck, you watch industrial input pressure because it transmits silently into margins, layoffs, and pricing power. The playbook remains behavioral. Don't chase the screen after the move. Track physical tightness weekly. Assume headlines lag plumbing. Treat spreads as the signal. Keep optionality. The unanswered file is the one the desks won't discuss on air. At what point does the market refuse deferral premiums and demand performance anyway? That moment doesn't arrive with a press release. It arrives when one large holder decides the terms are no longer credible and forces the system to reveal what the rule shift actually bought.